harkening back to last week, we were talking about some of the challenges that humankind is facing due to the restrictions, lockdown, distancing, quarantine, whatever you want to call it. We have a lot of euphemisms, but the situation is bringing up a lot of emotions for people: anxiety, grief, fear, and of course there's some anger. All are there. And some folks have also managed to find a new appreciation for human ingenuity and creativity during these times. For example, people have been inventing new cocktails and calling them quarantinis. Actually, the true definition of a quarantini is it's just a regular martini that you drink alone in your house. And then there's a guy who took the opportunity of this situation to solve, or at least to attempt to solve, the jury's still out on this one, to attempt to solve one of the greatest mysteries and perhaps the most confounding conundrum to plague philosophers everywhere. And he's telling the world about it on a handmade sign that's in the front yard of his house somewhere down in Florida, I guess. And the sign says this, it says, COVID-19 Day 20. I ordered a chicken and an egg from Amazon. I'll let you know. We're going to let that sink in for a minute. And of course, the other thing that I hear a lot of people complaining about during this time is gaining weight, right? Because people are cooking and eating at home, and this same guy found something to celebrate. So he put another sign out in his yard. This one said, COVID-19 Day 17. He said, yesterday I wore something from 5 years ago and it actually fit. It was a scarf. But still, let's be positive here, right? Indeed, let's be positive here, especially here. There have been so many opportunities to practice kindness, to cultivate empathy, and to embrace altruism. And just like everything else in life, this situation has its own polarities, its own set of positive and negative aspects. And of course, I would prefer to find a way to accentuate the positive, as the old song goes. So last week we talked about the all-important starting point for dealing with some of the negative reactions and to allow us to concentrate on the positive aspects. And we do that by not focusing exclusively on the external. Instead of focusing on all of the external things and all of the material things and the stuff that other people do that are largely out of our control, what we do instead is we focus on the things that are completely or at least partially in our control, and that is usually an inside job. We learn self-awareness. That's an important tool. We work on our spiritual and emotional intelligence, and then we find it easier to let go of the things that we can't control without experiencing a lot of turmoil. And that allows us to then shift easily to the things that are within our control. Those things that we think of as restrictions, obstacles, and impediments out there can be transformed. I ended last week with this quote from the Roman emperor and Stoic philosopher Marcus Aurelius, who said, "Our actions may be impeded, but there can be no impeding our intentions or dispositions, because we can accommodate and adapt. The mind adapts and converts to its own purposes the obstacle to our acting. The impediment to action advances action. What stands in the way becomes the way." And this week I've highlighted a few words to focus on because those are the words that show what I mean when I say it's an inside job. Our intentions, our dispositions, our ability to accommodate and to adapt, the power of our mind, all of those things are properly called intangible. And I firmly believe that the intangible side of reality is what we can what we can authentically call spirituality, the intangible side of reality, what goes on at the level of consciousness, this inside job and the work that we have to do to learn how to be able to become more accommodating and adaptable, as the philosopher says. I'm a huge fan of the scientific method, as I think all of you know. It excels at dealing with the tangible side of reality, and it has accomplished great things for humankind, but the scientific method isn't as well suited to discovering and deciding things like how to be good, how to get along, how to implement the golden rule. The best way starts with thinking and knowing what we want for our individual selves. And that, again, is an inside job, and that's what we're good at here at Unity of Auburn. Because we talk about meditation, the silence, going within, being still, emotional intelligence, spiritual intelligence, self-awareness, all sorts of things like that. And I hope that we do more than just talk about it or go about it as an empty exercise, because we're trying to reach that depth of self-awareness where we are really clear about what we want for ourselves and others, and that includes gaining this degree of mastery over the ego, the emotions, and things like that. Those are the things that try to drive the direction of our desires, and we don't want them running the show. That's the challenge. You know, there's an ancient aphorism which says, "Know thyself," which many attribute to Socrates and Plato, but it's older than that. The words you can find are inscribed at the Temple of Apollo at Delphi. There's also evidence that this saying originated in the ancient Luxor Temple of Egypt. It's slightly different, but there's a proverb from that temple which goes like this. It says, "Man, know thyself, and you are going to know the gods." So think about that one for a moment. Knowledge of that which we call God starts within, by knowing yourself, not out there someplace. And that idea is really the very foundation of what unity is all about. It was something that was so unique that it set us apart in the early days. Now, it's not such a unique idea to us anymore, this idea of God within, but that doesn't mean that we should abandon it. You know, I hear people in different unity circles lamenting that we have indeed abandoned ideas like that, and I guess that may be true in some places, not here, but it's challenging to hold on to those foundational ideas and concepts because they're not always easy to grasp. And sometimes there's not a lot of bling to them, and we're kind of conditioned in our culture to like things that are flashy and new, jumping from one thing to another. The foundation ideas are so important. Now I don't often quote directly from the work of Unity co-founder Charles Fillmore. He was the one who really pushed this idea of God within. I don't often quote from his work extensively because, let's face it, he wasn't writing self-help books. I mean, his stuff, if you've ever read any of Fillmore's books, it's tightly packed. Some might call it dense. It's difficult. It's challenging. Plus, the language and the syntax that he uses, I mean, it comes from 1800s Victorian English, so it sounds a bit archaic. But for those who haven't encountered his work, for those who have never read his work, I want to give you a little example here this morning of what I mean by that. You'll see a little bit about what I mean by it being difficult and challenging and the language and the syntax, but this is a direct quote, and yet it carries that core idea. This is something that we can actually work with. So here we go. This is from a book called Christian Healing. He says, "Man is created the image and likeness of God. Man is, therefore, a phase of God mind, and his mind must act like the original mind. Study your own mind, and through it you will find God mind. In no other way can you get a complete understanding of yourself, of the universe, and of the law under which it is being brought forth. When you see the Creator thinking out his universe, as the mathematician thinks out his problem, you will understand the necessity for the very apparent effort that nature makes to express itself. You will also understand why the impulse for higher things keeps welling up within your soul. All right. Take a few seconds to let that sink in. I just heard Karen over there go, whew. You know, that's, I remember when we went through most of his books when we were in ministerial school, and there were a lot of people knocking their heads against the wall afterwards, but there's a lot to unpack there. First of all, I think there's plenty of things in there that might just get a little reaction out of us. How about the exclusively male pronouns and imagery? Well, that's the way it was back then. Also, he called the book Christian Healing. Some people may have a slight allergy to that because it sounds a little bit parochial and exclusive. God, soul, creator could carry some baggage for some folks. So those are the things that you have to deal with here. And yet, what a revolutionary thing to say. Back in the days when traditional Christianity insisted that we were all worthless sinners who deserved to experience the punishing wrath of a vengeful and jealous God. Instead, Charles talks about an impulse for higher things that wells up from within, an inside job. Now, what might those higher things be? And I'm sure we have our own list of them. I suspect that for Charles, if I may be so bold as to speak for him, I think the first thing on that list would be truth. And this is consistent with what we find in many pre-Christian philosophical systems, Greek, Hindu, and others. In a way, Charles was trying to bring back some of these earlier ideas that were pushed aside when Christianity became an institution, and that's when human beings lost their inherent divinity. They lost their worth, and they became these helpless wretches in need of saving. Truth, goodness, beauty, that's how the ancient Greeks and other philosophical systems would summarize those higher things that we're naturally drawn to, that keep welling up within the soul. Truth, goodness, and beauty. The true, the good, and the beautiful, those were virtues that were identified by Plato as being necessary for a good or a happy life. And there are some folks in Unity who think that we're based, at least partially, on the philosophy of Plato. I think it's probably a little more than partially, but either way, the true, the good, and the beautiful, those are core concepts. Now Charles, in addition to those Platonic ideas, he had his own idea about our core human virtues, the virtues that make for a good or a happy life, and he called them the 12 powers. Now, they're not original to him, but he adapted them to Unity, and I will have to offer a little confession here, because when I first heard about the 12 powers, I wasn't a fan. You know, over the years, the 12 powers had been tinkered with, modified, and even embellished with a lot of, I'll call it irrelevant stuff, kind of burdens added on to the 12 powers, embellishments that weren't necessary. And it reached the point where they really didn't make any sense to me. They ceased to be practical. And then, when Karen and I were in ministerial school, one of our teachers, Jim Gaither, said that the 12 powers were Charles Fillmore's idea of the good. The 12 powers were Charles Fillmore's idea of the good, as in the truth, the true, the good, and the beautiful. That's when it clicked. Because back in my philosophy classes in college, we would be calling something like this, we'd be calling the 12 powers a system of virtue ethics, identifying the key virtues that we need to practice in order to have a good life, to avoid the inevitable roller coaster ride and turmoil that we can experience when we don't practice those things. So last week I mentioned the 4 core virtues of Greek Stoic philosophy. Those are courage, wisdom, justice, and self-control. And of course then they take those and divide them up into something like 18 more subdivisions. So you're gonna end up with a way more complex system than we have with just the 12 powers. We're not going to go into the Stoic stuff today, but just to give you an idea of how universal this is. The Buddhists, they have their own version of the 12 powers. They have a virtue ethics system called the paramitas, or the perfections. Instead of 12, they have 10. Generosity, morality, renunciation, wisdom, diligence, patience, honesty, determination, loving kindness, and equanimity. Now the number of them aren't important. 10, 18, 4, 12, whatever it is. It's a little bit arbitrary. It becomes just a matter of how you want to slice up the pie. So that's what Charles was up to. He was working on our own system of virtue ethics. When we look at these systems, there's some similarities, there are some differences, but the one thing that they all have in common is an attempt to identify what's needed to thrive in a world where there is so much that is not in our control. And that's a message that's being driven home by this whole thing for the past few months. All of the things that are not within our control, and the uncertainty that we have to deal with, which is very similar to not being in control. So, virtues are still valuable. They are the intangible things that we want to reflect on in order to counteract those negative reactions that we have to deal with when we're facing uncertainty and lack of control. Charles believed that this set of virtues were something that every human being naturally possessed. He would have called it God-given, and you can just as easily say that they are traits, that they are behaviors that developed via natural selection, because they proved to be adaptive. They're evolutionary. Last year, you might recall, I introduced a book here called Blueprint: The Evolutionary Origins of a Good Society. It was written by Nicholas Christakis. And he makes the case that, as Charles did, that humankind appears to have innate evolutionary qualities that have enabled us to gradually establish a more compassionate, peaceful, cooperative, and humane world. I'm going to give you a key idea from the book that kind of explains it. He says, my vision of us as human beings, which lies at the center of this book, holds that people are and should be united by our common humanity. And this commonality originates in our shared evolution. It is written in our genes. What Dr. Christakis shows is that despite a human history that is, in fact, replete with violence and dysfunction, we can't escape what he calls our blueprint for goodness, and that over time we're creating this call it a positive feedback loop that reinforces that tendency for goodness. This made me think about one of our basic unity principles. It's the one that says humankind possesses an innate quality that we call divinity, which makes us inherently good. But the key phrase that we need to remember here is the one which says we are creating a positive feedback loop. It's an act of creativity. It's not something that's automatic. The building blocks are there, but we need to keep working at it. And nobody is going to do it to us or for us, as traditional religions like to assure us. It's all going to be done to us or for us. It's up to us. So next week, we will continue with our exploration of not just the 12 powers, but other ways of describing these innate qualities that are going to help us to deal with times of uncertainty and times where we lack control. And actually we want to go beyond that, beyond just coping with turmoil and uncertainty. We want to move beyond that to finding what we can all call a legitimate form of happiness, even in the midst of all this, even in the midst of the whole catastrophe. So we'll pick that up again next week. Thank you for joining us.